The unbelievable incident that made me lose every ounce of love for the person I thought I'd marry. Hello, read it. 2 years ago, everything began to fall apart. My girlfriend dropped out of college, and from that point on, she seemed to lose all motivation for life. At first, I thought it was temporary. I told myself she just needed time to figure things out, to recover from whatever stress had caused her to leave school. But as the months turned into years, her behavior didn't just stay the same. It got worse. She completely stopped trying, not just with her career or education, but with herself. Meanwhile, I was working harder than ever. I started taking on 50 to 60-hour work weeks to cover all our expenses. It wasn't just the financial strain that wore me down. It was the emotional toll of seeing her do absolutely nothing to contribute. She'd stay in bed all day, every day, surrounded by takeout boxes. She barely even took care of herself. It became normal for her not to shower or brush her teeth, and the only time she'd get up was to collect food from the door. I couldn't remember the last time I saw her genuinely engaged with life. Yesterday was the day, all boiled over. I came home from work completely exhausted. It had been a particularly rough day, and all I wanted was to come back to some semblance of peace. Instead, I walked into the same scene I'd been coming home to for the past 2 years. Her in bed, half asleep, surrounded by the remnants of whatever she'd ordered to eat that day. She didn't even look at me when I walked in. I stood there, staring at her, and something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I told her she couldn't keep living like this. I told her it wasn't fair for me to carry everything while she did nothing. She didn't respond the way I'd hoped. Instead of showing any understanding, she got defensive, then outright aggressive. Things escalated, and she became physically violent. In that moment, I wanted to end it all, to tell her I was done. But then she started crying, telling me she had no one else to turn to, that she couldn't handle being alone. Her words made me pause. I felt trapped between my own desperation to leave and the guilt of abandoning her. I ended up staying, but I knew something had to change. That night, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. After a few hours of pacing around and thinking it over, I went to her room and told her we needed to talk. At first, she didn't take me seriously. She was bouncing on the bed, smiling like I wasn't about to say something that could end our relationship. But eventually, she realized I wasn't joking. I told her everything, how unhappy I was, how much her behavior was affecting me, and how I felt like I'd been carrying this relationship alone for years. I told her I was tired of waiting for her to get a job, go back to school, or even find a hobby. Anything would have been better than nothing. I told her how much it hurt to see her care so little about herself and our future. To my surprise, she listened. For the first time in a long while, she actually seemed engaged. She even started agreeing with me, saying she understood where I was coming from. She offered suggestions about places she could apply to and courses she might take. She promised she'd let me check her applications to prove she was serious. For a moment, I almost believed her. I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was the wake-up call she needed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. My feelings for her had faded. Slowly, I told her how I really felt, that I didn't love her the same way anymore. As I kept talking, it became harder to avoid the full truth. I didn't feel anything for our relationship at all. I was tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of trying. I told her I wanted a fresh start with someone who had ambition, someone who wanted more out of life. When she realized what I was saying, she broke down. She started crying, asking why I hadn't said anything sooner. She apologized over and over, saying she hadn't been in the right mental state. She told me nothing motivated her anymore, that she didn't have any interests or hobbies, and that the only thing she looked forward to was spending time with me when I came home. Her words made me uncomfortable. They didn't change how I felt, but they made me feel guilty. I tried to tell her I thought she'd be happier with someone else, but she panicked. She begged me not to leave, saying she'd do anything to make it work. She promised to change, listing all the places she'd apply to and all the things she'd do differently. She even swore she'd go back to school in August. Her desperation was overwhelming. She kept saying she couldn't lose me, that I was all she had left. I felt trapped again. Eventually, she begged me for one last chance. She asked for a month to prove she could change. I didn't believe much would come of it, but I agreed. I told myself it was a temporary solution, a way to give her time to adjust to the idea of us not being together. That night, I slept on the couch. Around 3 a.m., she came out and lay on the floor beside me. She apologized again and again, crying softly under her blanket until she fell asleep. This morning, she brought up something she'd seen on TikTok, a relationship exercise where couples take turns airing their grievances with a timer. I thought it was a ridiculous idea, but I agreed to try it. She asked me when I stopped loving her, and I told her it wasn't one moment. It was a slow process, a feeling that had built up over time. Then she asked what had made me the angriest. I wasn't sure how to answer at first, but eventually, the words started coming out. This has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I feel lighter now that I've started to say how I feel, but I know this isn't over. The next month or two will be telling, but deep down, I know what I have to do. I just hope I can find the strength to follow through. The hardest part of the conversation came when she asked me what moment made me lose my love for her. I told her about the time when I had just started working at the hospital. The workload was overwhelming, the pace relentless, and the expectations brutal. Every day felt like a trial by fire, and I had to constantly adapt, learning things that school could never have prepared me for while being expected to perform like a seasoned professional. It was the most stressed I've ever been, but it shaped me. That year taught me that hard work pays off if you have the drive and passion for it. Coming home to her during that time only made it worse. While I was being pushed to my limits, I'd walk into a house where she had done absolutely nothing. No meals were cooked, no chores were done, and she spent her days glued to her phone with nothing to show for her time. It wasn't just the inaction, it was the contrast. I was giving everything I had to my career, and she was giving nothing to her life. I tried to help. I gave her suggestions for jobs with flexible schedules, encouraged her to explore new interests, and even suggested she go back to school to study something less demanding. Every idea I offered was dismissed. I told her it disgusted me. I said it plainly, even though I could see the words cut her. She asked why I hadn't made it a bigger issue at the time, why I didn't communicate how much it bothered me. I told her some things shouldn't need to be said. I shouldn't have to remind her to take care of herself, to shower, to eat properly, to do something other than mindlessly scrolling on her phone all day. After spending my days dealing with the chaos and stress of the hospital, the last thing I wanted was to come home and beg my girlfriend to be productive. So I stayed quiet. I justified it to myself by focusing on her kindness and affection. I thought those qualities were enough to outweigh everything else. But the resentment kept growing. I admitted something I regret now. That over time, I became mean. When she dropped out of nursing, I was upset because I believed she was capable of handling the challenges. I had done it, after all. But as I got to know her more, I realized she wasn't the type of person who could finish something like that. That's why I suggested easier jobs or more laid-back majors. Even if she just picked up cooking or found a hobby, I would have appreciated the effort. Instead, she did nothing. Years passed, and it became clear that this was who she was. That's why I fell out of love with her. She asked me if I hated her. I told her I didn't know. I admitted that I hated how she had handled her life to this point, but I didn't hate her as a person. I felt no ill will toward her after airing everything out, but I also felt nothing else. I was done. I was ready to move on. Throughout the conversation, we kept eye contact. I could see her fighting to keep calm, even as my words made her want to break. She asked if she could respond later, and I agreed. She locked herself in our room for the rest of the day. The next morning, we sat down to finish the conversation. She told me she thought she might be depressed. She said she didn't feel sad, exactly, just completely unmotivated. A few people had suggested I encourage her to get tested for ADHD, so I brought it up. She shut the idea down immediately. She wasn't comfortable with the thought of being tested, and I didn't want to push her too hard, though her refusal surprised me. She hates needles and hospitals, so I tried to explain that it wouldn't be like a regular hospital visit, but she still refused. She asked if I would give her another chance if she changed her behavior. I told her I didn't know. I was honest. I didn't feel anything right now, and I wasn't sure if her changing would bring those feelings back, especially since it had taken reaching my breaking point to even have this conversation. She asked if there was any kind of compromise we could reach. I repeated what I'd told her before. If in a month I felt there was enough reason to stay together, I would. But I couldn't guarantee that my feelings would return. I also said I'd match any effort she put into improving herself. She was frustrated by my answer, but it was the only one I could give. Later, she showed me a piece of paper she had been working on. It was a list of hobbies and interests she wanted to explore, with photography and cooking as the top two. She also showed me her phone, where she had proof that she was applying for entry-level jobs on Indeed and Glassdoor. I told her that if she could show real passion or interest in those hobbies, I wouldn't care if she didn't work. All I wanted was to see her improving herself. But if she didn't follow through, I thought it would be best for her to find a job to help support herself when she moved out. A few trusted coworkers I confide in warned me about what might happen next. They told me this could be a cycle, that she might put in just enough effort to convince me to stay before falling back into old patterns. They said I needed to stand firm, and I knew they were right. Still, I can't help hoping that, for her sake, this time will be different. When I decided to give the relationship one last chance, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. My friends at work, who I trusted completely, had been vocal about their doubts. They were convinced I was setting myself up for failure. They warned me that being around her would leave me vulnerable to her manipulation. Their advice came from a good place. They cared about me and had seen me struggle over the last couple of years. They even offered to let me stay at their place for a few nights, urging me to put some physical and emotional distance between us. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. It didn't feel right. Technically, we were still in a relationship, even if it was a fractured one, and I felt obligated to see it through before taking that step. I told my friends I'd consider their offer if the situation worsened. Despite their skepticism, I appreciated their grounded advice and trusted their perspective, especially since they'd been instrumental in helping me make positive changes in my life, like quitting smoking earlier that year. For now, though, I wanted to try to make things work, even if my heart wasn't fully in it. I was guarded, skeptical, and emotionally closed off. I didn't have any confidence that things would improve, but I felt I owed it to her, and maybe to myself, to give it one last shot. Plenty of people, both friends and strangers who'd messaged me privately, told me this might be a mistake. But there were also voices encouraging me to stick it out, to see if enough effort on both sides could reignite something. I decided to give it a month as promised, and to meet her halfway. I started by setting boundaries. No physical intimacy, and no sharing a bed. I moved to the living room, where I slept on the couch. But even with those boundaries, she couldn't give me the space I needed. Every night, she would drag a blanket to the floor and sleep right below me. I asked for time to be alone with my thoughts, to process everything, but she refused. She said she couldn't accept being apart from me, even if only by a room. Her refusal to respect that boundary only added to the strain I was feeling. But I bit my tongue and focused on fulfilling my part of the agreement. The first week after our conversation was a whirlwind. She threw herself into what felt like a manic burst of energy, trying to explore new hobbies and interests to prove she could change. It was overwhelming to witness. She bounced between ideas. One day it was cooking, the next it was painting, and the day after that it was writing. Ultimately, she settled on photography. To fund her new interest, she sold some old clothes on Depop and used the money to buy a Canon 250D camera. She seemed genuinely invested in the hobby, researching techniques and equipment. More than anything, I think she chose photography because it gave her an excuse to spend more time with me. She asked me to go out with her to test the camera and take pictures around the city. Even when I came home after long, draining shifts at the hospital, I agreed. I had promised to match her energy, and I didn't want to be a hypocrite. So, despite my exhaustion, I went along. During this time, she became hyper-attentive. She asked me how I was feeling, if I was upset, if there was anything I wanted to do, multiple times a day. She tried to gauge my mood constantly. Her affection, which had always been consistent, became almost overwhelming. She wanted to hold hands, kiss, and stay out late, even when I told her I had to be up early for work the next day. It was exhausting, and while I didn't say it out loud, I was bracing myself for the crash I knew was coming. The crash came in the second week. I was already feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. My work at the hospital was demanding as always, and now I had this added pressure at home. My coworkers noticed how much more tired I seemed and pulled me aside to talk about it. They urged me to take care of myself, warning me again that I was being love-bombed and that this burst of effort on her part wouldn't last. They asked what I would do if things didn't improve after 2 months, and I told them I was prepared to leave. My lease would be up soon, which gave me an easy exit if it came to that. Still, their concern stuck with me. That weekend, they insisted I go out with them. They said spending so much time at home, in the middle of this tense situation, wasn't good for my mental health. At first, I declined, but when they asked again on the day I agreed. Spending the day with them turned out to be exactly what I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. I laughed, relaxed, and let go of the stress that had been building up. When I got home, she was waiting for me. She was disappointed I hadn't spent the day with her, but I promised we'd spend the next day together. She accepted my promise, though I could tell she wasn't happy. The tension started to show during one of our outings to the city. Her mood was noticeably off, and when we got home, she accused me of being dismissive. She asked if I was upset with her. I tried to be honest, explaining that her constant need for affirmation and affection was overwhelming me. I told her I needed space, especially since I wasn't getting any time to myself at home. I was physically and emotionally drained. While I didn't mean for my words to hurt her, I could see they did. She withdrew completely, avoiding me for the rest of the day and the next. Her mood became darker, more brooding. Looking back, I wish I had handled it differently. Maybe if I'd apologized or communicated better, things wouldn't have escalated the way they did. But I was so tired, mentally, emotionally, and physically. I needed the quiet. I used that time to nap and be alone, something I hadn't been able to do in weeks. By the third day, everything came to a head. I left for work in the morning without checking on her or saying goodbye, which was unusual for me. She had been sleeping in our room again, and I assumed she was still asleep. At work, I felt better than I had in days, but I had no idea what was waiting for me when I got home. That evening would mark a turning point in our relationship, one that would send ripples through the days and weeks to come. That day started off as one of the better ones I'd had in a while. After taking some much-needed time for myself, I felt rested, clear-headed, and emotionally stable for the first time in weeks. Work at the hospital, which was typically stressful and draining, was surprisingly smooth. Even the occasional opportunity to join my co-workers for meals after shifts felt inviting. Over the past few weeks, I've been declining those offers, retreating home instead, but that day I decided to go. We shared food, drinks, and good conversation, and it reminded me of what life felt like outside the confines of the strained situation at home. By the time I arrived back at the apartment, it was late, around 9 p.m. or later, and I had a slight buzz from a couple of drinks. As I walked in, I immediately noticed her sitting silently in the living room. She wasn't on her phone, watching TV, or doing anything else to pass the time. She was just sitting there staring blankly ahead. Her stillness startled me, and as I stepped inside, she turned her gaze directly to me. It felt as if she'd been waiting for hours. I asked her what she'd been doing, but she didn't answer. Instead, she asked me where I'd been. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a weight behind her words. I told her I had gone out with friends. Her next question came quickly. Were they my coworkers? I nodded, explaining that we'd gone out to eat. She followed up by asking if I'd been drinking. I wasn't sure if it was obvious or just a guess, but I admitted that I had. An uncomfortable silence followed, stretching out longer than I could stand. Eventually, she broke it by bringing up the looming deadline, the month I'd given her to see if my feelings could change. Her voice was steady at first, but I could tell she was struggling to keep her composure. She asked if anything had changed for me yet. Her question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before responding. Finally, I told her that I appreciated her efforts and could see she was trying, but I still wasn't sure about our future. I couldn't give her a definitive answer. That's when the conversation started to unravel. She told me that during our outings, she felt I wasn't putting in the same effort to make the relationship work. She said I seemed distant, quiet, and dismissive, and that my lack of enthusiasm was wearing on her. I tried to explain that I was tired, Working long shifts at the hospital was exhausting, and I didn't always have the energy to be talkative or cheerful. I reminded her that she already knew how I felt and that it shouldn't be a surprise if my mood reflected my mixed emotions. But she didn't seem to believe me. She told me she was constantly overthinking, wondering how I felt now that she knew I'd lost my love for her. She said she had no idea what she could do to bring those feelings back. I told her, again, to focus on finding a passion for something, anything that could get her out of bed and make her feel alive again. She replied through tears, saying she had been as active as she could possibly be for the past 2 weeks. She said she was pushing herself to her limits, but my mood hadn't changed. She was starting to question if anything ever would. That's when she broke down completely. Through sobs and a trembling voice, she poured everything out. She told me how much she loved me, how much affection and care she had poured into our relationship, and how deeply hurt she was that I was throwing it all away. She said my reasons felt like excuses to end things, as if I had never really loved her at all. Her voice grew louder, her tears flowing uncontrollably. She confessed that even though she was angry and felt betrayed by the one person she thought she could rely on, she still loved me and desperately wanted to save the relationship. She said that if I left, she would have nothing, no one to turn to, no purpose, no future. She told me she wouldn't know what to do with herself. The more she spoke, the more her emotions spiraled. At one point, she was almost screaming, completely consumed by her despair. She said there would be no reason for her to live if this was the end. She admitted that another month wouldn't make a difference because she believed I still wouldn't want to be with her, no matter what she did. I stood frozen, unable to respond. I'd never seen her fall apart like this. Her pain, raw and unfiltered, left me at a loss for words. When she finally stopped, she locked herself in our room. For the next few days, she refused to speak to me. Anytime I knocked on the door to try to talk, she screamed at me to go away. I respected her request and gave her space. During those days, I had the time to be alone with my thoughts, time I hadn't had in weeks. It was during that time that I realized what I needed to do. When she finally emerged, she was calmer but visibly drained. She apologized repeatedly for the things she'd said during her breakdown, explaining that she had been speaking out of anger and fear. She admitted that much of what she said wasn't what she truly felt, but what had spilled out in the moment. Her attitude was softer, more defeated, and the energy she'd had in previous weeks was gone. I knew it was time. I sat her down and, as gently as I could, told her that it was over. I explained that there was no way for us to be together anymore, that I no longer wanted to be in the relationship. I told her I would give her 2 more months to find a job and get on her feet, and that I would help her during that time. But I also told her that if she couldn't make progress, I would be gone by the end of that period. She started crying again, but this time it was different. Her tears were quieter, her voice resigned. She agreed to the terms, and just like that, it was done. A week later, she got a part-time job at a supermarket. Our communication became minimal after that. When she wasn't working, she stayed in her room, avoiding me entirely. I stayed on the couch, which had become my space, and didn't mind it. It felt selfish to admit, but I felt free, genuinely happy for the first time in a long while. I didn't tell my coworkers about the breakup right away. Instead, I vaguely mentioned that we were working on things and started going out with them more often after work. Being in the apartment felt like a chore, a reminder of everything that had happened, so I avoided it as much as possible. Those moments outside, surrounded by people who cared, became my lifeline. Getting sick with pneumonia was the start of an unexpected chapter in the weeks following my decision to break up. It hit me hard, a relentless fatigue, coughing fits, and the inability to take a deep breath without pain. Initially, I thought it was just a cold, but within days, it felt like my lungs were operating at half capacity. My body forced me into rest, with 12 to 14-hour stretches of sleep, and most of my waking hours spent lying down. For the first time in years, I was physically incapable of managing everything on my own. When I told her about my diagnosis, her reaction surprised me. She offered me the bedroom, insisting I'd be more comfortable there. I declined. It didn't feel right after everything that had happened, even if I was struggling. At first, she left me alone, respecting my space. But by the middle of the first week, she started checking on me, asking if I needed anything to eat or drink. I hated that being sick forced us to interact. It wasn't anger or resentment I felt. It was awkwardness, a deep discomfort at having to depend on her so soon after we'd broken up. I couldn't even manage groceries, so she insisted on handling it. When I offered her my card, she refused, saying she'd buy what we needed herself. She also took it upon herself to cook for me, something I hadn't asked for and even resisted at first. But she wouldn't take no for an answer, insisting that I needed real meals if I was going to recover. For that first week, we didn't eat together. She'd drop the food off and retreat to her room. By the second week, however, things began to shift. She started sitting with me during the times I was awake, sharing stories about her day at work, her co-workers, and little things she'd experienced. It was like a floodgate had opened. She talked and talked, unloading all the things she hadn't said during the tension of the past month. At first, I wasn't sure how to respond, but over time, I found myself listening more and even enjoying the conversations. It felt different, less strained, more natural, almost reminiscent of when we'd first met and were just friends. As the days went on, the awkward distance between us seemed to lessen. We began spending more time together, watching TV on nights when I couldn't sleep or talking through issues we'd both been holding on to for a long time. For the first time in years, there was no yelling, no arguing, just open and honest communication. It was cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. One day, toward the end of my illness, I hit a particularly rough patch. I felt so weak I couldn't get out of bed, coughing too much to sleep or even think clearly. She noticed and stayed home from work that day, sitting quietly by my side. She didn't try to talk or fill the silence. She just made sure I was drinking water and eating what little I could manage. Her presence was calming, even though neither of us said much. Those 2 weeks were a turning point, though not in the way either of us might have expected. They gave me time to reflect, not just on my physical recovery, but on the state of my relationship, my emotions, and my future. I couldn't find the words to fully describe what I felt during that time, but it was a lot. After I recovered, I started making a more deliberate effort to talk with her, though it felt more natural than it had a month ago. We began having random, casual conversations about her photography or coworkers, her thoughts on her boss. It wasn't forced, it felt organic, almost comfortable. She spent less time in her room and more time in the living room, sharing pieces of her day. I did the same, talking about work and the challenges I was facing. Over the weeks, our dynamic transitioned from being exes to being friends, though there was still an unspoken barrier between us, something neither of us could fully address. As September approached, so did the deadline I'd set for moving out. I had decided weeks earlier that I wouldn't renew my lease. I needed a fresh start, away from her and the memories of what had been. The closer the date came, the more I prepared myself mentally. On the last Saturday of the month, I told her it was time. I explained my reasons calmly, saying I needed to focus on myself and my future, and that living together was no longer an option. As I spoke, I saw the realization settle in her expression. She began to cry, and almost immediately, an argument erupted. She accused me of abandoning her, of throwing away our love for no reason. She said I didn't care about the progress she'd made or the effort she'd put in. She couldn't understand why I would leave when, in her eyes, we'd been getting along better. I tried to stay calm, telling her this wasn't about abandoning her, but about taking care of myself. Her accusations stung, though, and I could feel the tension escalating. Then, in a moment of rage, she lunged at me. I didn't see it coming. She struck me across the face, and I stumbled back, shocked and confused. The room fell silent. Her anger melted into panic as she realized what she'd done. She began apologizing immediately, but I was already reeling from the betrayal. I left the apartment to clear my head, driving aimlessly through the city. The weight of everything that had happened bore down on me. Eventually, I ended up at a nearby hospital after calling a friend who insisted I get checked out. Physically, I was fine, but the emotional impact lingered. As I sat in the waiting room, I reflected on everything: our relationship, the breakup, the tension, and now this. When I was discharged, I knew I needed to make one last move to close this chapter. I sent her a message, telling her I wouldn't press charges, but that I needed her to stay away from me. I reminded her that she had a lifeline, her job, her hobbies, her own potential, and urged her to use it wisely. I told her I wanted no further contact and wished her well in moving on. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't look back as I closed the door for the last time. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. Free from the weight of the past, free to start fresh, and free to rebuild my life on my own terms.